Can a single ship change the future of an entire regime? And if it can, why do dictators start to panic long before the first missile is ever fired? Before we go deeper, if you like smart breakdowns without the usual noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this with one person who loves sharp world analysis. The title sounds explosive, almost cinematic. The USS Nimitz will take down another Iran-friendly dictatorship. That sounds like the start of a war movie. But the real story is more serious than that, and in some ways, even more unsettling. Because the true power of a ship like the Nimitz is not only what it can destroy, it is what it can make people realize. It can force leaders, generals, financiers, smugglers, and even loyal insiders to face the same terrible question at the same time. What happens when the system protecting us stops looking permanent? That is how regimes begin to crack. Not always with bombs, not always with invasion. Sometimes the first real collapse happens in the mind. In the moment when a ruling circle understands that the map around them is changing faster than their propaganda can explain, they wake up to a new reality. Their foreign backers are far away. Their economy is weaker than they admitted. Their military is more political than professional. Their enemies are better armed, better coordinated, and more patient than expected. Then fear spreads through the palace before it spreads through the streets. So, if we are talking about the USS Nimitz, we are really talking about a symbol of organized pressure. A nuclear-powered carrier is not just a warship. It is a moving statement. It says the United States can arrive fast, stay longer than most governments can stay calm, and create options day after day without asking anyone nearby for permission. It changes the psychological weather. It makes every radar screen, every secret meeting, every fuel shipment, every airfield, and every political speech feel different. That matters a lot when the regime in question is already unstable. And that is the real heart of this story. Iran-friendly dictatorships do not just survive on ideology. They survive on networks, oil deals, smuggling routes, intelligence support, political cover, black market finance, fear, patronage, the image of durability, the belief that even if people hate the regime, nothing can actually remove it. Once that belief is damaged, everything becomes more fragile. The generals start to hesitate. The business elites move money out. Border commanders make quieter calls. Propaganda becomes louder because confidence becomes weaker. This is why ships like the Nimitz matter far beyond their deck. They do not operate in a vacuum. They arrive as part of a larger message that includes surveillance, diplomacy, sanctions, legal pressure, regional alliances, and strategic ambiguity. That last part is especially important. Strategic ambiguity makes authoritarian systems nervous because they never know which line is the real red line. They do not know whether a military deployment is a bluff, a warning, a shield, a negotiation tactic, or the opening chapter of a campaign they are no longer strong enough to resist. Now think about the kinds of governments that align themselves with Tehran. Many of them are not united by deep trust. They are united by need. They need weapons, money, intelligence links, energy deals, or anti-Western political theater. They need a narrative that tells their supporters they are part of a larger axis of resistance. But behind the speeches, the relationship is often less romantic than it sounds. It is transactional. It is opportunistic. It is held together by common enemies more than common values. That creates a weakness. If outside pressure begins to isolate one of these regimes, its friends have to make a calculation. Can we really save them? Do we want to pay the cost? Do we risk our own assets, our own pipelines, our own commanders, our own shipping lanes, our own political survival for a partner whose future suddenly looks shaky? That is when alliances that once looked bold start to look thin. The Nimitz enters that picture like a clock you can hear ticking. Its very presence creates deadlines, not formal deadlines announced at a podium, but private deadlines inside ministries and military headquarters. How long can we keep flights running? How long can we protect our coastal infrastructure? How long until insurers panic? How long until traders back away? How long until our own people realize we have fewer options than we claimed? How long until the inner circle starts looking for an exit plan? And make no mistake, dictatorships fear elite betrayal even more than public anger. Public anger can be repressed, it can be delayed, it can be divided, but elite betrayal is different. Elite betrayal means the regime's own machinery starts doubting the operator. Once that happens, every institution becomes dangerous to the ruler. The military might not obey, the intelligence service might leak, the central bank might hesitate, the family members of top officials might start moving abroad. Suddenly, the problem is not a hostile fleet outside the country. The problem is that the regime no longer fully controls the people inside the country who know how weak it really is. That is why the phrase "take down" can be misleading. The Nimitz may not need to physically conquer anything to help bring down a regime. It may only need to make an already rotten structure feel surrounded by time, exposure, and consequence. In the modern world, hard power and perception work together. A carrier group says force is available. Markets hear risk. Allies hear resolve. Enemies hear uncertainty. Citizens hear possibility. And this is where authoritarian governments often make their worst mistakes. They mistake noise for strength. They hold rallies. They threaten retaliation. They flood television with patriotic slogans. They arrest more critics. They speak in the language of defiance because they are terrified of the language of weakness. But every overreaction reveals stress. Every theatrical threat tells the world the regime feels pressure. Every emergency decree whispers that control is slipping. If you have watched enough crises, you start to notice a pattern. Collapse rarely begins with one dramatic strike. It begins with compression. Economic pressure tightens. Military pressure hovers. International patience thins out. Internal trust decays. The regime tries to project confidence, but its moves become more reactive and less strategic. It lashes out in ways that reassure its base for a day and alarm its real power brokers for a month. It confuses performance with stability. That is a fatal mistake. And here is the part many people miss. The United States does not have to love intervention for intervention to become possible. It only needs to decide that the cost of letting a hostile dictatorship keep deepening its links with Iran is worse than the cost of sustained pressure. In that calculation, the Nimitz is not just a military platform. It becomes leverage. It tells every actor in the region that Washington has not left the board. It tells hedge players, fence sitters, and quiet opportunists that they should think very carefully before betting on the survival of the regime. That warning does not only travel to the palace, it travels to regional militias, shipping networks, intelligence cutouts, and businessmen who have been making money from chaos. Suddenly, the people who benefited from the regime's survival begin to consider a different future. Maybe the system is not immortal. Maybe loyalty is now a liability. Maybe the smart move is not to fight for the last inch of the old order, but to survive the transition to whatever comes next. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what aircraft carriers represent in the modern imagination of power. They are not cheap. They are not subtle. They exist because some nations want the ability to shape events far from home without waiting for a crisis to become a catastrophe. A carrier gives a state endurance. It gives decision makers time. It gives commanders options. It gives diplomats a harder edge. And it gives dictators an unwelcome reminder that distance is not safety. For a regime tied to Iran, that reminder can be devastating. Iran's strategy often works best in the gray zone: influence through proxies, pressure through deniability, support through networks that blur the line between state action and shadow action. That style can be effective against weaker neighbors, distracted coalitions, and fragmented governments, but it becomes much harder to scale when a major naval presence arrives with the ability to watch, track, deter, and if necessary, strike. The whole ecosystem of plausible deniability starts to shrink. That does not mean war becomes inevitable. In fact, the opposite can be true. Clear strength can reduce miscalculation by showing a regime exactly how narrow its room to maneuver has become. Dictators often act recklessly when they think their opponents are hesitant. They become more cautious when they believe hesitation is over. This is one of the paradoxes of deterrence. The stronger and more credible the message, the less likely the most extreme outcome may become. But even when deterrence succeeds, it can still destabilize a dictatorship because it exposes the limits of its power in public view. Quick pause in the middle of the storm. If this breakdown is giving you a clearer view than the headlines do, hit subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who still thinks power is only about who fires first. Imagine what that does inside a tightly controlled state. For years, the regime has told its people that it is untouchable. It has told officers they are part of a historic mission. It has told elites that the system may be ugly, but it is permanent. Then the Nimitz appears in the regional picture, and suddenly permanence looks negotiable. Even if nothing is fired, the dictatorship has to answer questions it hates. Can it protect trade? Can it secure the coast? Can it keep fuel moving? Can it guarantee the loyalty of every commander if pressure rises? Can it stop panic from spreading through circles it cannot publicly admit are nervous? This is why maritime power can have land consequences. The battlefield is not only geographic, it is financial, informational, and psychological. If a dictatorship depends on imports, exports, energy routes, illicit shipments, or foreign guarantees, then outside naval pressure can shake its inner balance. You do not have to occupy the capital to make the capital feel exposed. You only have to alter the regime's confidence in its ability to maintain normal life, reward loyalists, and punish defectors. And when normal life begins to break, propaganda becomes harder to sell. Citizens may not understand the full strategic picture, but they understand shortages. They understand delays, fear, and official lying. They understand when powerful people suddenly become harder to reach. They understand when state media sounds forced. They understand when the words on television no longer match the mood on the ground. Once that gap opens, the regime enters a dangerous zone. People do not need certainty to lose faith. They only need a believable reason to doubt. That doubt is contagious. A taxi driver hears it from a cousin in customs. A soldier hears it from an officer who is usually calm. A port worker hears it from a shipping contact who says insurance costs just jumped. A bureaucrat hears it from a banker who is moving money quietly. A party loyalist hears it from a local boss who suddenly speaks less confidently. These are the invisible cracks that matter long before the cameras arrive. And authoritarian rulers know this. That is why they try to frame every foreign pressure campaign as proof of their own importance. They want the public to believe the outside world is obsessed with them because they are strong. But that argument has an expiration date. Once the public starts asking why a strong state looks so nervous, the spell weakens. Once insiders start asking whether the leader's decisions created unnecessary danger, the spell weakens faster. The USS Nimitz in this kind of scenario becomes a mirror. It forces a regime to see itself without slogans, without the flattering myths of revolutionary destiny, without the fantasy that all enemies are weak and all friends are loyal. It reveals logistical truth, operational truth, strategic truth, and authoritarian systems are often at their most brittle when truth arrives all at once. Now let's go deeper into the word another. That word is doing a lot of work in the title. Another Iran-friendly dictatorship suggests a pattern, not a one-off event. It suggests that regimes aligned with Tehran may share the same hidden vulnerabilities. They often depend on fear more than legitimacy, external ties more than domestic strength, and narratives of resistance more than actual resilience. That does not mean they all fall in the same way, but it does mean pressure can expose similar weaknesses. One weakness is over-centralization. Dictatorships love centralized control because it keeps rivals weak. But that same design makes adaptation slower. Too much depends on too few people. Too many decisions travel upward. Too much fear travels downward. In a fast-moving crisis, that is dangerous. People stop taking initiative because the cost of making the wrong decision is high. Everyone waits for orders. Everyone protects themselves. Delay becomes policy, and delay, under pressure, becomes decay. Another weakness is corruption. Corruption can buy loyalty for years, but in a crisis, it turns into a tax on survival. Supplies move slower, maintenance gets skipped, commanders lie about readiness, contracts exist on paper and fail in reality. Smugglers who once enriched the regime suddenly start hedging against it. The same networks that helped the dictatorship endure in quiet times become unreliable when the winds change. A third weakness is the illusion of ideological unity. Many hardline regimes speak as if their supporters are one solid bloc. They are not. Some are loyal to the leader, some are loyal to money, some are loyal to tribe, region, or survival. Some are only loyal because fear made alternatives look impossible. When outside pressure changes the perceived future, these factions stop moving as one. The regime may still look monolithic on camera, but behind the curtain it becomes a negotiation among frightened men. That is where a ship like the Nimitz becomes more than hardware. It becomes timing. It arrives when pressure needs a visible anchor. It tells the regime the world is watching. It tells internal opponents they are not imagining the shift. It tells regional actors that events may accelerate. And it tells everyone sitting on the fence that waiting too long could put them on the wrong side of history. But let's stay honest. None of this is clean. None of this is simple. The fall of a dictatorship is not a tidy chess move. Even bad regimes can leave behind chaos when they weaken. Power vacuums are real. Militias compete. Criminal networks adapt. Foreign patrons look for new entry points. Ordinary people suffer first and recover last. So when people cheer the phrase takedown, they often forget the hardest part is not breaking a regime. It is shaping what comes after. That is why the smartest strategy is not blind escalation. It is controlled pressure tied to political preparation. If a regime begins to crack under military, economic, and psychological stress, there must be a plan for transition. There must be channels to the military elements willing to step back from fanaticism. There must be support support for institutions that can function without the dictator. There must be a way to separate the most committed enforcers from the wider population. Without that, the collapse of fear can be followed by the spread of chaos. And this is where many outside observers get lazy. They imagine the story ends the moment the strong man looks weak. It does not. That is the midpoint. The real test comes after. Can the country move from personal rule to lawful rule? Can it keep the lights on, the ports open, and the borders stable? Can it prevent foreign intelligence services from turning the transition into a proxy battlefield? Can it convince exhausted citizens that this time, change will mean more than new faces on old corruption? The reason this matters for an Iran-friendly dictatorship is obvious. Tehran benefits when broken states remain broken but useful. Disorder can be exploited, institutions can be penetrated, proxies can be armed, political factions can be played against one another, so the goal cannot simply be to make the old regime fail. The goal has to be preventing a vacuum that invites a deeper, darker version of the same problem. That means the Nimitz, if it becomes part of such a story, would represent only one layer of a much larger strategy. It would be the visible edge of power, not the whole design. Behind it would have to stand intelligence work, diplomatic coordination, legal isolation of regime figures, and a serious effort to split hardliners from pragmatists. Real pressure works best when it offers some people a reason to abandon the sinking ship, while making it very dangerous for the worst actors to keep steering it. And that is the detail dictators fear most. Not simply attack, choice. When the inner circle is given a choice between loyalty and survival, ideology starts losing fights it used to win. Men who once shouted about eternal resistance begin making practical calculations. Their children study abroad, their assets sit in vulnerable places, their mistresses talk, their drivers listen, their bodyguards notice things, their enemies keep records. The state looks solid from a distance, but up close it is a web of private anxieties held together by public theater. A credible American carrier presence can tighten all of that. It can make every secret weakness feel urgent. Before the final stretch, here is my deal with you. If you want analysis that respects your intelligence instead of drowning you in slogans, subscribe now, like the video, and share it with one friend who always asks, what is really going on here? It can make middle-ranking officers think twice before executing a brutal order that may age badly in the next government. It can make businessmen wonder whether continuing to bankroll the regime will leave them trapped under sanctions or prosecution. It can make neighboring countries cooperate more openly because the balance of risk is changing. And once regional actors begin to reposition, the dictatorship loses something every authoritarian system desperately needs: the sense that the future is still theirs to script. At that point, time starts working against the ruler. That is a nightmare for dictators because time is usually their weapon. They wait out outrage. They survive headlines. They count on democratic societies getting distracted. They assume foreign resolve will fade before their repression does. But a long-endurance military platform backed by broader strategy flips that equation. It says, no, this time pressure can stay. This time uncertainty belongs to you. And that shift can be devastating. A regime that expected symbolic condemnation now faces sustained exposure. A military that expected routine posturing now sees real capability nearby. A loyalist class that expected business as usual now feels the temperature rising. The public may still be afraid, but fear changes direction. It no longer flows only from the state to the people. It begins to flow back toward the state itself. That is often the beginning of the end. Not the end you see in one dramatic image, but the end made of 100 quiet reversals. A canceled meeting, a delayed payment, an unanswered call, a commander who suddenly reports a problem instead of hiding it, a minister who avoids public appearances, a propagandist who sounds less certain, a businessman who leaves town, a family member who starts asking about exit routes, a foreign patron who goes silent, a population that senses weakness for the first time and never fully unsees it. So, will the USS Nimitz take down another Iran-friendly dictatorship? Maybe the better answer is this. It can help make the old illusion impossible to maintain. It can help close escape routes, narrow choices, and expose a regime that has been living on borrowed confidence. It can turn distance into pressure and pressure into doubt. And when a dictatorship built on fear begins to doubt itself, history moves faster than anyone expected. But the deepest lesson is not about one ship. It is about the kind of power authoritarian rulers never truly understand until it is too late. They understand violence. They understand censorship. They understand theatrical strength. What they often fail to understand is disciplined, patient pressure backed by institutions that can sustain it. They fail to understand that credibility is a weapon. Endurance is a weapon. Coordination is a weapon. Truth, when it finally breaks through the noise, is a weapon too. That is why a carrier on the horizon can matter even before the first command is given. It tells the regime that the outside world can see the whole board. It tells insiders their secrets are not as safe as they thought. It tells citizens that permanence may have been a lie. And it tells history that some systems do not fall because they were hit first. They fall because, at last, they were made to see they could fall. If that moment comes for another Iran-friendly dictatorship, it will not just be a military story. It will be a story about fear changing sides, about propaganda meeting reality, and about the instant a regime realizes the future is no longer taking orders from the palace. And when that realization spreads, even the loudest dictatorship can begin to sound hollow. That is when the countdown truly begins.